Hi, I'm Sam,
And I'm Cameron.
and we're going to go over how Dillard uses the motif of imperfection throughout for the time being to highlight, ironically enough, consistency and uniformity of nature.
Wait, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, does any of the book make sense?
Touche.
So the first thing we're going to have to do is determine a solid, consistent, and uniform. Get it? Because we said uniform before. Definition for perfection with what we're given by Dillard.
Dillard gives a plethora of examples that can be grouped under the discrete, albeit obscure concept of perfection, and this collection of vignettes, slowly building up Dillard's view of what perfection actually is. Dillard speaks of how round a grain of sand is related to its age, and in a physical context we know that a sphere is an object that is perfectly round, has no flaws in its surface, and is perfectly circular. But why call attention to the age? Why not just declare that some sand grains are nearly spherical or perfect? Because nearly is the key word here. Dillard intends to tell us that there is more to perfection than just uniformity, be it the radius, the curvature, or spacing between rows are a definition of what constitutes God. Perfection is relevant to time, and by associating the passage of time with the perfection in the form of the sand grain, she reveals that her perfection is relevant to time, and that until enough time has passed, each grain can only be nearly spherical.
Towards the end of her work, Dillard makes reference to a man in the distance as she is standing outside the tomb in Xi'an. This man is walking what she describes as perfect silence, preserving the stillness of the auditory environment. What we have at this point is a direct reference to a characteristic of Dillard's ideal of perfection, not only in the physical level of silence being purity of air from the disruption of sound waves, but silence being purity of any and all defects, absence of sound, absence of soul, absence of life, the end of existence. This idea of the end of all things culminates all she builds up throughout the collection of vignettes: the uniform curvature of sand grains, breakdown of historical artifacts, the vast expanse of time that it takes for the end to come. From this, we can gather three things about Dillard's personal view of perfection. 1. Perfection is uniformity, as demonstrated in the references to the roundness of sand grains and constant roundness of sand grains in the world. 2. Perfection is absence, from her references to silence, death, and God's role as Deus Otiosus, a do-nothing God that ignores the plight of those who suffer. And 3. Perfection takes time, as not only does it take time to make each grain of sand more spherical, it takes time for humans to die and decay, for our bodies to be absent of soul, absent of life, battered into ashes, and becoming part of the sand grains on their journey to perfection.
But Sam and Cam, what does this have to do with imperfection? How can imperfection reveal uniformity? What is the point in all of this?
Shh! We're getting to the juicy part.
Now that the definition of perfection has been established, now for the more pressing question. Why does Dillard showcase so much imperfection? Imperfection is evident from the beginning of the book in the subsection Birth. You can easily identify the stark contrast between Dillard's ideal of uniformity and the characteristics of children with birth defects. Some of them are really big, some of them are really small, some of them are deformed. In Birth in chapter 3, Dillard talks of another defect in the midst of a normal crowd, defective germplasm in shriveled peas. She points out that this defect is found in almost every pod, a situation very unlike the perfect uniformity described by Dillard. Dillard points to three specific examples of imperfections in the word of a paleontologist: failures, disintegrations, and death, all of which cause human distress. These imperfections are described as necessary to pay for every small success. But how could this be if imperfection is the opposite of perfection towards which all success is motivated?
Throughout the story, she also throws out quite a few statistics about people dying, whether it's 138,000 people dying in a flood, or 750,000 people dying in an earthquake, or 27,000 people dying in a seismic sea wave. Dillard shows us that the aforementioned imperfection of death is everywhere. The world is wrought with imperfection, and nowhere near perfect. Wait, death is everywhere? It's consistent? What was Dillard's definition of perfection again? Let's go back to the defective germplasm in the peas. She mentions that this happens in almost every pod. That's another description of a consistent imperfection. And the fact that she says almost every pod, where else did she mention something like that? The nearly round sand particles. The sand particles were not exactly spherical, just as the defective peas are not exactly in every single pod. What is Dillard trying to show us? It's a paradox. There is no such thing as perfection, but imperfection is perfectly omnipresent. Even evil has its own blemishes. Dillard specifically quotes a rabbi's statement that a spark of goodness rests in the depths of evil. It takes time for us to all be reverted to dust, for all matter to be broken down into perfectly round particles, and as time passes, things that are broken down get closer and closer to perfect. But until all time has elapsed, until the end of time, until the end of existence, the universe remains imperfect. Perfection is the absence of existence. The quintessential example of perfect imperfection is found in the terracotta soldiers from the tomb in Xi'an. They are each different, all alert, in rows, strictly uniform in formation, but each individual in their own respect, each one with its own blemishes and imperfections. Dillard even explained that the sight made her see lives from the aspect of eternity, where she felt dead and long gone. Death is the absence of spirit in the body. This intertwines the three qualities of perfection, uniformity, absence, and time, with the nature of imperfection, identifying perfection as a single entity with its polar opposite.
Ultimately, Dillard wants us to see there is no imperfection without perfection and no perfection without imperfection. This is a pattern seen consistently in the nature of behavior, the nature of existence, and the nature of time. So, just lighten up. Don't worry about the B- you get on your English paper or the C you got on your math test, because without it, the A+ would not have any value at all.
But don't go around filling stuff on purpose, because that might make Mr. Wolf annoyed, which could have huge consequences on his normally uniform hairstyle.